German pilots were terrified when radar locked onto them in the clouds. July 16, 1940, 23,000 feet above the chalky cliffs of Dover. The air is thin, bitterly cold, cutting through leather and wool like razors made of wind. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler adjusts his oxygen mask, feeling the rubber press against his stubbled jaw. Below him, the English Channel churns gray and endless. Above, the sky stretches impossibly blue, unmarked by cloud or contrail. He banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a shallow dive, scanning the horizon for the expected formation of RAF hurricanes. Intelligence has placed them somewhere over Kent. His wingman Hans flies 300 meters to his left, a dark cruciform against the summer sun. Then it happens. The radio crackles, not with voices but with something else. A high-pitched whine oscillating insistent like metal screaming. Stigler frowns. He checks his instruments. Oil pressure normal. Engine temperature within range. The sound grows louder, more urgent. Hans breaks radio silence. "Do you hear that?" Stigler does. And for the first time in his 27 combat sorties over Britain, he feels something he has not felt since his first training flight 3 years ago. Fear. Not the adrenaline-soaked fear of dogfighting, of seeing tracer rounds arc past your canopy. Not the rational fear of flak or engine failure. This is different. This is the fear of being seen when you cannot see back. The fear of being hunted by something invisible, where you are with a precision that feels almost supernatural. He pulls back on the stick, gaining altitude, twisting his head left and right, searching for the enemy he knows is coming but cannot yet locate. Within 90 seconds, 3 RAF Spitfires emerge from a cloud bank 2,000 feet below him, climbing fast, their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines howling. They should not know he is here. The clouds should have hidden him. The altitude should have given him the advantage of surprise, but they know. They have always known. In the summer of 1940, the German Luftwaffe stood as the most technologically advanced, combat-proven air force in the world. It had annihilated the Polish Air Force in 18 days. It had swept the French from their own skies in 6 weeks. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, publicly boasted that no enemy bomber would ever penetrate German airspace, and for a time, that boast seemed grounded in reality. German pilots were confident, their aircraft superior in many respects to their adversaries. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E, the backbone of the fighter force, could outclimb most Allied fighters. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber had become a symbol of blitzkrieg terror, its sirens shrieking as it plummeted toward bridges, tanks, and troop columns. Britain, by contrast, appeared vulnerable. Its army had been evacuated from Dunkirk in chaos. Its allies on the continent had fallen. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, spoke grimly of blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but words would not stop bombers. By mid-July, Hitler had issued Führer Directive No. 16, outlining plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe's task was clear: achieve air superiority over southern England, destroy the Royal Air Force, and pave the way for the Wehrmacht to cross the Channel. German pilots expected a repeat of France. A few weeks of hard fighting, perhaps, but ultimately another swift victory. What they did not expect, what no amount of pre-war intelligence had prepared them for, was the invisible eye watching them from the moment they lifted off from their bases in occupied France. The British called it RDF, radio direction finding. Later, the world would know it by its American designation, radar, and it changed everything. Radar was not a singular invention, but the culmination of years of incremental scientific work across multiple nations. In the 1930s, physicists understood that radio waves could be reflected off solid objects. The challenge was turning that principle into a practical system, capable of detecting aircraft at operationally useful ranges. The Germans had experimented with radar. So had the Americans, the French, the Soviets. But Britain, faced with the existential threat of aerial bombardment and lacking the geographic buffer of vast landmasses, pursued radar with an urgency bordering on desperation. In 1935, Robert Watson-Watt, a Scottish physicist working for the British Air Ministry, demonstrated that radio waves could detect an aircraft at a range of 8 miles. By 1936, the first experimental radar station was operational at Bawdsey Manor in Suffolk. By 1940, a chain of radar stations stretched along Britain's southern and eastern coasts, codenamed Chain Home. These were not sleek, futuristic installations. They were tall, ungainly steel towers, some reaching over 350 feet, festooned with wire antennas that hummed and crackled in the coastal wind. They looked more like scaffolding for industrial construction than instruments of war, but they could see. They could see a formation of bombers assembling over Calais when those bombers were still 50 miles from the English coast. They could estimate altitude, heading, and speed. They could feed that information to fighter command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where it was plotted on enormous maps by uniformed women pushing wooden markers across tabletops. And from there, RAF fighters could be scrambled, vectored, and positioned to intercept the incoming raids. For the Germans, this was incomprehensible. German pilots had been trained to rely on visibility, on the Mark I eyeball, on cunning and positioning. A fighter squadron would climb to altitude, scan the skies for enemy formations, and dive to attack. Clouds were concealment. Altitude was advantage. Surprise was the fundamental currency of air combat. Radar rendered all of that obsolete. Suddenly, German bombers crossing the Channel found themselves intercepted before they reached their targets. Suddenly, fighter sweeps intended to draw the RAF into attrition battles met coordinated resistance. Suddenly, pilots like Franz Stigler, confident in their training and their machines, found themselves ambushed again and again by an enemy who seemed to possess an uncanny, almost occult foreknowledge of their movements. The psychological impact was profound. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe pilot who would survive the war and later publish his memoirs, described the sensation in stark terms. It was as though the English could see through clouds, through darkness, through weather. We began to suspect they had spies everywhere, that perhaps our radio communications were compromised. Some of the men whispered about secret weapons, about devices that could read our thoughts. It sounds absurd. Now, but in the cockpit alone, with British fighters appearing out of nowhere, such thoughts did not seem so absurd. This was not paranoia born of inexperience. These were men who had flown over Spain during the Civil War, who had strafed Polish cavalry and bombed French air bases. They were not easily shaken, but radar shook them. The Germans did eventually identify the Chain Home towers. Reconnaissance flights photographed them. Luftwaffe intelligence correctly guessed they were related to radio detection. But understanding that radar existed and neutralizing its advantage were two different problems. The towers were sturdy, difficult to destroy with bombs. Even when damaged, they were quickly repaired. And the Chain Home low stations, designed to detect low-flying aircraft, were even harder to target because they used smaller, more dispersed antennas. More critically, the Luftwaffe never fully grasped the integrated system behind the radar. They saw the towers but did not understand the nerve center at Bentley Priory, the communications network, the filter rooms, the plotting tables. They did not comprehend that British air defense was not just a collection of radar sets, but an entire asterisk system of detection, communication, and response. RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had created something unprecedented. A networked defense, where information flowed seamlessly from radar operators to controllers to pilots. The Germans had superior aircraft in some respects. They had experienced pilots. They had numerical superiority at the start of the Battle of Britain. But they were fighting blind against an enemy. In late July, Luftwaffe units began to report increasing losses. Bombers that should have reached their targets unopposed were intercepted. Fighter escorts found themselves outnumbered, not because the RAF had more planes. They did not. But because RAF fighters were being concentrated at the right place and time. German pilots began to notice patterns. They would take off from their bases in France, and by the time they crossed the English coast, RAF fighters were already climbing to meet them, already positioned for an advantageous attack. August 13, 1940. Adlertag, Eagle Day. The Luftwaffe launched its most concentrated assault yet, intending to destroy RAF fighter command in a single, overwhelming blow. Over 1,400 German aircraft took to the skies. Goering expected the RAF to be annihilated within days, but the RAF did not oblige. Fighter command's controllers, guided by radar plots, scrambled squadrons precisely where they were needed. German formations were harassed, broken up, forced to drop their bombs early or miss their targets entirely. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 45 aircraft. The RAF lost 13 fighters, but most of the pilots survived. More importantly, the radar chain remained intact. Over the following weeks, the Battle of Britain ground into a brutal calculus of attrition. The Luftwaffe shifted tactics, targeting radar stations directly in mid-August. On August 15th, several chain home stations were damaged or temporarily knocked offline. For a brief period, the Germans created gaps in the radar coverage. But the damage was repaired within hours. The system adapted. Mobile radar units filled in gaps. The network held. And still, German pilots found themselves intercepted. Still, they felt the invisible eye upon them. Günther Röhl, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, later recalled, "You could feel it. Even when you couldn't see them, you knew they were coming." The British pilots flew differently. They were not desperate. They were not surprised. They knew we were there before we knew they were. It was unsettling. Unsettling, a careful word. But in the diaries and letters of German airmen from that summer, the language grows darker. Frustration, fatigue, dread. Pilots who had joked and sung on their way to Poland now flew in silence. The expectation of a swift victory curdled into the realization that this battle would not be won easily, if at all. There is a recorded incident, partially documented in RAF intelligence files, of a German bomber crew that bilaid out over Kent after their Heinkel He 111 was shot down in early September. The crew, uninjured and taken prisoner, was interrogated by British intelligence officers. One of the gunners, a 22-year-old from Bavaria, asked his captors a question. "How do you always know where we are?" The interrogator, following protocol, deflected. The German pressed. "We change our routes. We fly at different altitudes. We come at different times, but you are always waiting. Always." The interrogator offered nothing. But in his report, he noted the gunner's demeanor. Not angry, not defiant, but afraid. The subject appeared to believe that British defenses possessed some form of supernatural or advanced scientific capability beyond his understanding. This fear was not isolated. Throughout September, as the Luftwaffe shifted from attacking airfields to bombing London in the Blitz, the terror of radar persisted for German fighter pilots. While bombers could hide in the darkness, relying on night to shield them, fighters still flew daylight missions, escorting the bombers or sweeping ahead to clear the skies. And in daylight, radar still ruled. By the end of September, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft. Pilot attrition was unsustainable. Experienced flight leaders were dead or captured. Replacements arrived with minimal training, and they died even faster. Goering, desperate and humiliated, blamed his pilots, accused them of cowardice. He rotated commanders, changed tactics, demanded impossible results. But the invisible eye never blinked. On October 31, 1940, the Luftwaffe flew its last major daylight raid of the Battle of Britain. After that, it conceded the skies. Germany would continue to bomb Britain, but it would do so at night, when radar was less effective, when the darkness offered some measure of protection. Daylight belonged to the RAF, and the Germans knew why. The symbolic weight of radar extended beyond its tactical utility. To the German pilot, trained in the romantic militarism of the Third Reich, warfare was supposed to be a test of will, skill, and courage. It was supposed to be personal man against man, machine against machine. The ace fighter pilot was a modern knight, dueling in the sky, his victories a testament to his individual greatness. Radar stripped away. It reduced the pilot to a blip on a screen, a target identified and tracked by faceless technicians in underground bunkers. It turned air combat into a system, an equation. The Germans were not being outfought by superior courage or skill. They were being out-managed, out-organized, out-thought. This was deeply demoralizing. The British, by contrast, embraced radar not as a loss of honor but as an extension of collective strength. RAF pilots understood that they were part of a larger machine, that their survival and their victories depended on the men and women manning the radar stations, the plotters at Bentley Priory, the ground crews rearming their aircraft. There was no shame in this interdependence. It was, in a sense, democratic. Every person in the system mattered. The radar operator scanning her screen at 3 in the morning was as vital to victory as the fighter pilot pulling 6GS in a turning fight. The Germans had no equivalent. Their system was hierarchical, rigid, built on the cult of the individual leader. Goering's Luftwaffe was designed for offensive operations, for shock and speed. It was not designed for the kind of defensive, networked warfare that Britain had perfected. And so, as the summer of 1940 turned to autumn, the psychological advantage shifted. German pilots who had crossed the Channel expecting glory now flew their missions with the knowledge that they were already being watched, already tracked, already hunted. The sky, once a realm of freedom and mastery, had become a cage of invisible walls. One object, recurring in the memoirs and letters of Luftwaffe pilots from this period, appears again and again. For radar, time was elastic in air combat. A patrol might last 2 hours or 4, depending on fuel, weather, and whether you encountered the enemy. You took off, you flew your route, you returned. Time was something you controlled. After radar, time became oppressive. Pilots began to obsessively check their watches. How long until the RAF arrives? How many minutes until we reach the coast? How much time before our fuel forces us to turn back? The watch became a symbol of their helplessness, a reminder that they were being observed, that their every movement was known, that they were running out of time in a battle they could not win. Oberleutnant Werner Merlders, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter pilots, noted in a letter to his brother, "I find myself looking at my watch more than at the horizon. It is a bad habit, but I cannot help it. The British are always there, always punctual. It is as if they have scheduled our deaths." Merlders survived the Battle of Britain, only to die in a transport plane crash in 1941. But his words capture the existential shift that radar imposed. The Germans were no longer the hunters. They were being hunted by an enemy who existed in a dimension they could not access, the dimension of asterisk information. By the spring of 1941, the Battle of Britain was over. Hitler had postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely and turned his attention eastward, toward the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF. It had failed to break British morale. It had failed to achieve the air superiority necessary for an invasion. Historians would later identify many reasons for this failure: the Luftwaffe's strategic incoherence, Goering's incompetence, the courage of RAF pilots, the industrial capacity of British aircraft production. But the pilots who fought over Britain, on both sides, knew the truth. Radar had won the battle. The Germans would go on to develop their own sophisticated radar systems. By 1943, German night fighters used airborne radar to hunt RAF bombers over the Reich. The Wurzburg radar guided flak batteries with deadly accuracy. Late in the war, German scientists developed radar-absorbent paint and early stealth technology. But it was too late. The psychological wound inflicted over Britain in 1940 never fully healed. German pilots learned to respect radar, then to fear it, then to expect it. The confidence that had carried them across Europe evaporated, and in its place grew a grim pragmatism, the recognition that technology had outpaced valor, that the future of war would be decided not by the bravest pilot but by the side with the better machines, the better systems, the better information. Epilogue. There is a museum in Kent, not far from Dover, where fragments of the Battle of Britain are preserved. Twisted aluminum from a Messerschmitt, a parachute harness, a pilot's logbook. And on one wall, a photograph of a chain-home tower, stark against a gray sky, its antennas strung like the web of some vast mechanical spider. Visitors often pass it without much notice. It is not dramatic. It does not gleam or roar or inspire. It is just a tower. But that tower saw what the human eye could not. It gave Britain time when time was running out. It turned the invisible into the visible, the unknown into the known. And in doing so, it revealed a deeper truth about the nature of modern conflict. Wars are no longer won by individual heroism alone. They are won by systems, by networks, by the patient accumulation and application of knowledge. Radar did not make British pilots braver or their aircraft faster. It gave them something more precious, awareness asterisk. It gave them the ability to see the enemy before the enemy saw them, to concentrate force where it mattered, to fight on their own terms. For the German pilots who flew into that invisible net in the summer of 1940, the lesson was bitter. They had expected to fight men. Instead, they fought a machine that never slept, never panicked, never doubted. A machine that simply watched, waited, and whispered coordinates into the ears of those who knew how to listen. And when Franz Stigler, decades after the war, was asked what he remembered most about the Battle of Britain, he did not speak of dogfights or victories or fear. He spoke of the sound, that high-pitched whine in his headset, the scream of radio waves bending around his aircraft, marking him, hunting him. "I heard it in my dreams for years," he said. "Even now, sometimes, I wake up and think I can still hear it, the sound of being seen." That sound, more than bullets or bombs, was the sound of the future arriving. A future where the sky belonged not to the boldest, but to those who could see farthest. And Britain, in its darkest hour, saw farther than anyone else.